Well, in response to President Trump's decision to proceed with tariffs on an additional $200 billion worth of Chinese imports, China released a white paper today to clarify its position and unveiled some key facts countering the U.S. narrative on its trade dispute with America. It emphasizes that trade tensions between the two sides is causing serious damage to economic relations and poses a major threat to the multilateral trading system and the principle of free trade. Now, after this latest salvo in escalation in China-U.S. trade frictions, what happens next? What industries on both sides will be worst hit? And what can China do to minimize the impact of U.S. tariffs? To discuss these issues and much more, we are joined by Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics and Professor Paul Gillis from the Guanghua School of Management at Peking University. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Michael Wong. But before we get started, let's take a closer look at some of the key details of today's white paper.
The white paper says the United States is China's largest export market and the sixth largest importing source. In 2017, the bilateral trade volume hit over $580 billion U.S. dollars, 233 times higher than that in 1979, when the two countries established diplomatic ties. Since its ascension to the World Trade Organization, China has been one of the most important export markets for the U.S. Statistics show the amount of U.S. exports to China reached over $129 billion U.S. dollars last year. That number was also 112% higher than the U.S.'s export growth to the world in the same period. The white paper also maintains that the trade gap between China and the U.S. is a result of differences in their economic structures. Even though China exports more consumer goods to the U.S., it's the flip side for the services trade. Last year, the U.S.'s services trade surplus to China hit more than $54 billion U.S. dollars. Despite all of that, the white paper admits that Washington had indeed used trade bully tactics to jeopardize the economic development of other countries. The Bank of England predicts that if the U.S. increases its tariffs to 10% to all of its trading partners, then its own GDP will probably be reduced by 2.5%, and the global economy will see a 1% dent. The Trump administration's take on trade protectionism will also harm the global industrial chain. Take the first round of tariffs on Chinese goods, for example. About 59% of those goods are produced by companies from America, Europe, Japan, and South Korea. They are the ones footing the bill. As for Washington's accusations of China, quote, stealing advanced technologies, the white paper says China's research and development expenditures in 2017 reached more than 1 trillion yuan, ranking second worldwide. Over 100 Chinese companies entered the world's top 1,000 innovation companies, ranking third after the U.S. and Japan. The Chinese government says it is responding from the perspective of common interests of both parties, as well as global trade order. It has defined its position on the situation, saying economic globalization is an international trend and that trade protectionism goes against the course.
All right, professors, welcome to the program. Let's get our conversation started. So we've got the white paper right here, and I was looking through this earlier today, and one of the core messages I think that you can really derive from this white paper is that China is really detailing sort of the multilateral environment of the China-U.S. economic relationship, that this really is a win-win relationship, that the U.S. wins and China wins from China-U.S. trade. But the mentality from Washington right now, obviously one of zero-sum, right? Whereas I lose, you win, sort of a victimhood mentality. Why is there such a gap here, especially with the U.S. being the largest economy in the world, right? Professor, let's start with you.
Well, Trump got elected because he promised to put America first. And so multilateralism and global trade is not something that in his mind puts America first. If the U.S. imports a product, it means that some domestic manufacturer did not get that opportunity to make that sale. So it was a loss. So his idea would be zero trade would be acceptable. That throws out the entire economic system that we've had for the last 50 years, where we've tried to encourage multilateral trade. And the business community is committed to free trade and multilateralism, but quite clearly Trump and his people are not.
What do you think, Professor Gong? Because President Trump is a businessman, right? And we've heard industry leaders from public hearings talking about how this will impact their businesses, and especially small businesses going forward with increased trade tensions.
Well, I think this report is mostly coming from an economics perspective, but we clearly know that Donald Trump's agenda is more than that. I mean, he has concerns about bringing jobs back to the U.S., for example. He has concerns for keeping a distance, keeping a gap, technology gap between China and the U.S. He may even have some geopolitical concerns behind this. And in addition to this, I'm starting to suspect that this could be possibly a means to distract attention from the Mueller investigation. I mean, this is not an argument I invented. For example, Paul Krugman has an article about this, and he said, unfortunately, American people probably right now don't pay much attention to the China trade. He has to invade Venezuela to distract attention to this. But anyway, so I think that this report, also I think the arguments in this report are something we have already been talking about for some time. Yeah. And I really don't think that it's really can persuade the Trump administration. I think it's a little bit too late. It's also a little bit too little. And he a lot of people in his administration, people like Peter Navarro, Robert Lighthizer, these people are not going to buy into these arguments. And clearly, the win-win situation, the win-win arguments doesn't resonate well with these people. They think that it's only the China side that has been benefiting from this China trade with the U.S. since China's accession to the WTO 17 years ago. So I think it's something they probably just brush aside, I think.
But why, Professor Gillis, is there such a one-sided narrative? Because looking through this report, there's a lot of numbers, right? We can talk about U.S. businesses here in China in 2016, for example. This report saying not made in terms of profits, but revenues over $600 billion in 2016. U.S. exports to China grew at some 577% from 2001 to 2017. U.S. financial services really making money here in terms of Chinese IPOs going abroad and using U.S. investment banks. So why isn't there a more holistic view, a more holistic narrative of the China-U.S. commercial relationship back in the States?
Well, the U.S.-China Business Council, the U.S. China Chamber of Commerce here in China has come out against these tariffs because they recognize that American business has done very well in China. Now, also, a lot of the exports from China are actually coming from American companies. The iPhones are all made in China, and they're treated as imports into the United States, even though they have heavily international components in them and a lot of American content in them. Nonetheless, they are considered to be part of that trade deficit, and one of the biggest parts of it.
And Professor Gong, also in this white paper, China says that the U.S. is violating WTO rules when the U.S. is calling for fair trade, because fair trade, I guess, is premised on an America First policy. So in terms of how fair can that be if it's based on an America First policy? And we have this reciprocity rule in the WTO, right? Reciprocity actually means for two developed economies. But if you have a developing and a developed economy, that's actually not full reciprocity. It's relative reciprocity by WTO standards. So isn't U.S. sort of rules unfair just to start with?
I think this is talking about Article 25 in the GATT agreement. And this agreement says that we have to go to the WTO to initiate any dispute resolution process for any kind of actions like this. But clearly, the U.S. side has violated Article 25, and the argument about developing and developed country, I don't think the Donald Trump administration really buys into this argument. They don't think China is a developing country, right? So the idea of a developing country at WTO is kind of an interesting topic. It's an interesting concept. It's not actually agreed upon. I mean, it is actually agreed upon, but they don't have a strict standard with respect to what is a developing country or what is a developed country. When China, the rule is that when you self-declare when you join WTO. So China, of course, 17 years ago, declared itself as a developing country, and there wasn't much disagreement about this issue. So China joined as a developing country. But over the years, in the eyes of the Trump administration, things have really changed. We have our GDP right now is about $10,000 per capita basis, and they think that China is no longer a developing country. So in his view, we have to be reciprocal. The tariffs have to be reciprocal. The tariff rate has to be the same. So my personal opinion about this is that this is something that's actually subject to negotiation. I think it is. My personal opinion is that China can take this issue, should should take this issue to the negotiating table and say, look, this is something maybe we can talk about, as opposed to just imposing these sort of very harmful tariffs and not getting to the negotiating table. That is very, very unfortunate.
And of course, Professor Gillis, also something that happened today is the imposition of 10% tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods. That is subject to go up to 25% January 1st, 2019. If we don't get a deal before then, China has said repeatedly that it won't negotiate under pressure, but this message doesn't seem to be getting through to Washington.
No, I think Trump apparently is already surprised that China hasn't already caved in based on this, and I don't see that he's going to be quickly willing to back down. And I think it's going to have to take quite a shock to the U.S. economy before he might reconsider some of the advice he's been receiving from his advisors.
I want to ask you both about this. There's been a lot of talk in U.S. media, Professor Gong, about perhaps China underestimating President Trump's administration's resolve to prolong the trade conflict with China. Do you think Washington perhaps is underestimating China's resolve also to stay in this?
I totally agree with you. I think there probably exists underestimation on both sides. And now we are into a situation where it's very difficult for either side to back off. Clearly, we have a very different system than in the United States. So clearly, our administration is not going to cave in easily, as Japan did, when Robert Lighthizer was dealing with Japan at the time as the deputy USTR. Deputy USTR. But this is going to be very, very different. So the issue of whether Chinese side underestimate the U.S. resolve, I think you might be right. Actually, I think we probably underestimate the motivations behind this. We probably thought that this is mostly a trade deficit issue, and most a job issue, but clearly it's more than that. I mean, there's a school in the United States that deliberately want to have a decoupling with China in terms of economic relationships. These are the people maybe on the labor side in the Democrats camp. There may be also these people behind the defense complex on the Republican side. These people treat the China trade as something only benefiting these very large companies, technology companies, that in their eyes are sort of traders anyway. They don't care about these companies, their interests in China, their interests of over $600 billion of revenues every year in China. They probably don't care about this. So it's a very difficult situation in that we don't take that into consideration probably. So now it's becoming very clear to me, at least, that it's a broader and deeper agenda here, and we probably should prepare for a scenario where this probably will unravel as what Jack Ma has predicted. That's going to prolong for a long time, and I think even if that happens, it's not a big deal. I give you one example. Canada and the United States was engaged in the world's longest trade war for over 70 years, and after the U.S. ends the Reciprocal Act dealing with China in 1800. And see what happens. It's not a big deal. I mean, both countries can still coexist, hopefully peacefully. And even if we get to that stage, I think this country is resilient enough to be at the forefront of this.
Okay. Professor Gillis, I want to get your take on that as well in terms of, is Washington sort of underestimating China's resolve to stay in this?
I think so. I have heard that Trump is surprised that China hasn't already conceded to this pressure. I think he fails to understand China's resolve on this issue and China's commitment to staying with the global trade system that we've had for so long. And I think that will make it harder for him to back down.
What about, there's this statistic from the Global Trade Alert, which is an initiative started by the Center for Economic Policy Research based in Washington, D.C. This is basically a data set which tracks the number of protectionist measures by major countries after the global financial crisis from 2009 until now. And actually, the country that ranks #1 in terms of the most harmful interventions to global commerce Can you both guess which country that might be?
Probably the United
Probably,
States.
it is the United States with 1,541 measures. When I was checking this morning, it was 1,539. So it went up by 2 in a span of a few hours, and that's 2.75 times higher than the second highest ranking country in terms of harmful interventions. Professor Gillis, what is your take on this? What's going on here?
Well, what we've seen in China is that a lot of the complaints about China not having opened its market, realistically, over the last 30 years, China's opened its market tremendously, and the market has grown quite expansively. The real concern, I think, that Trump and many of his people have is that the process of globalization has left people behind, and those people are his supporters. And those people believe that those manufacturing jobs that left the United States that came to China can come back to the United States, and that can once again pay $50 an hour plus benefits. I think those are unrealistic expectations, but that's what's driving them.
But what's going to happen? We've been talking about the fourth industrial revolution. We just wrapped up the summer Davos in Tianjin, and when we have these really high-skilled jobs and people can't sort of reskill for this, not just in the United States, but everywhere, what's going to happen then? Are we going to see increased populism in the United States and elsewhere as well as we get more technologically advanced?
I don't think populism is going to go away when Donald Trump goes away. This is a much bigger problem, that there are many people left behind, and there are going to be even more left behind as a result of the fourth industrial revolution, as we go to robotics and autonomous driving vehicles and artificial intelligence. And we've got to find some way to support those people. And China's going to have a problem just as big as the United States on that when these reforms come in.
But
Real quick, Professor.
I'm very skeptical. I'm a little bit skeptical about retraining these people. You know, there's a saying that's difficult to ask an old dog to learn new tricks. So, you know, his political base, these people are about 40 years old, and it's very difficult for them to get into a new profession and learn something new. And so they're going to just stuck there and sort of withering away, and they're going to vote for him. They're going to believe in him, whatever he does, whatever he says. So it's a difficult situation. I don't think they're going to change.
Okay. All right, gentlemen, stay with us. We're going to take a short break. More here on Dialogue when we return. Welcome back to a dialogue here. Professors, I want to get your take on the moves by the Federal Reserve, because we are expecting the FOMC decision on Wednesday. Given where trade tensions between China and the U.S. stand right now, and with this escalation to $200 billion, do you think the Fed's normalization policy, is that going to continue at its current pace, Professor Gillis?
I think they'll continue at the current pace until they have new information. I don't think they will accelerate it, even though I think that there's a very high likelihood we're going to see increased inflation because of the tariffs. I think they will be reluctant to try to head that inflation off by slowing the economy, because I think they will view that the trade tensions will create enough brakes on the economy already.
Okay. And what about in terms of rising interest rates? I mean, we are expecting 2 more for this year, including the one on Wednesday, and then for next year, possibly 2 interest rate hikes as well. If we see rates rise, I mean, U.S. corporates have been used to sort of a low yield environment for so long now. Right. And if we see rates increasing, is that going to be a problem for debt service and for corporates going down the road?
I think I'm less concerned about this, because corporate America's financial stand is still very healthy. I mean, it's washed with cash. They're taking cash back brought back to the U.S. So I think from a financing cost perspective, I don't think it's a very much of a big deal. So I think, and right now the U.S. economy looks still quite healthy. I'm not sure about the stock market. I know you have a strong opinion about that. but if you look at the stock, if you look at the general economy in general, it's still very healthy. You know, growth is very decent. Job picture is very healthy. So I think overall, you know, the impact is could be quite small. And I still have to keep in mind that the Sino-U.S. trade, in the grand scale of things, is still a very small percentage on the U.S. economy. I mean, on the China side, it's also very small. I mean, even if we get to the real, you know, the worst doomsday scenario, where you totally write off the total exports to the U.S., that's $500 billion, over $500 billion. The value added of that is probably 2/3 of that, and that's still less than 20% of China's GDP. So it's, it takes a small dent into the China's GDP, and this is something I think we can live with, but even in the worst scenario.
It's the perception, sort of a lack of confidence, perhaps, by businesses to invest, right? I mean, if we do see a doomsday scenario where we see tariffs going up to 25% and potentially $267 billion of Chinese goods, the rest of Chinese imports into the United States, that gets taxed. I mean, how is Wall Street going to respond to that, Professor Gillis?
Well, I don't think Wall Street's going to react to this until we start to see an effect on corporate earnings. And I would predict that won't happen until probably the first quarter of next year. Because, in fact, the last quarter, the quarter that's ending here in another week, is probably going to be very strong because there were many shipments anticipating that these tariffs would take place. Things will start to slow down in the fourth quarter, but I think it really hits in the first quarter of next year. And that's when I would look for some real impact on U.S. corporates.
If we see that impact on U.S. corporates, how big of an impact do you think that's going to do to the Trump tax cuts?
Well, I think what we'll see is we're going to see a huge correction in the stock market is likely to happen. At that point, I don't see any pressure to reverse Trump's tax cuts because that's not the time to do it. But the tax cuts certainly have helped to fuel the strong market that we have today.
Yeah. And Professor Gong, in terms of the next steps by China, I mean, China right now has been quite measured in terms of its response to the U.S. Do you think, in terms of next steps, perhaps a more aggressive response will be more convincing to the folks over in Washington, or how should we proceed?
Yeah, that's I'm very concerned about that. I mean, it looks increasingly like there's not much sort of candidness from U.S. side in coming to the negotiation. If that's the case, the Chinese side is not going to make any concessions. It's going to further strengthen the political force in China to be tough on the United States, and that's going to be even more difficult for those sort of reform-minded people to make concessions to the U.S. side, and that's going to be a more of a political problem in my opinion. So now we have a situation where it's very difficult for both sides to make any concessions, and what's going to happen then, right? So that's a real concern. I'm a little bit pessimistic actually. Hopefully by November, when President Xi and Donald Trump are going to meet in G20 meeting, and my prediction is that if they're not going to make a deal by that time, we're going to get into a very, very
protracted,
horrible situation.
How do Chinese businesses respond and prepare for these negative impacts, Professor Gillis?
Well, most Chinese businesses, most of the state-owned enterprises don't export much, so they won't be heavily affected by it. And actually, a lot of the exports actually are coming from foreign companies and from the suppliers to foreign companies. I think what you're going to see most companies doing is reevaluating supply chains. I think it would be negligent right now for any board to not be asking their management what's the contingency plan for our supply chain. And we'll see some movement of manufacturing and supply chains to other countries to try to avoid this problem.
But that takes a long time. Right now,
and it's going to take years for that to happen.
Okay.
Right. But this is actually already happening, actually. I mean, in a larger context, capital is already starting to move out of China, regardless of this trade war. Because according to this, there's the new economy geography theory, clustering manufacturing is moving from one place to another in a historic sense, and it's already starting to happen. I mean, it used to be in Europe, it went to U.S., and then to North America, and then came to Asia, in Japan, South Korea, came to China. It's been in China for 20-some years, and it's about time to leave. So they're leaving anyway. So I think I'm not surprised that plans are already on the drawing board for some American companies, contemplating moving away. So
but it's hard to replace Chinese supply chains, though, right? Because it's so well developed here in this country.
It takes time, and this kind of quick disruption makes it very difficult because it's a process. I mean, the movement to China was a 20 to 30-year process, and the movement to wherever's next, which is a whole bunch of places, including perhaps some of it back to the United States, and some to Mexico, and some to Vietnam, and some to India. That's also going to take some time. It has been underway for some time. Nokia basically already shifted out of China to Vietnam years ago.
And of course, we have to ask about the midterm elections coming up in early November. I know Professor Gillis and Professor Gong, you both sort of don't think that this will have too much of an impact on the trade issue. What do you think? I mean, in terms of the latest numbers, it seems like the Democrats have a rather good chance of taking the House. If they do, is that going to have any significant impact on where we stand?
It's viewed that about an 80% chance that by most reputable pollsters, that about an 80% chance the Democrats will take the House and about a 1/3 chance they take both the House and the Senate. That would clearly make life quite difficult for Donald Trump, but he has actually used rules that do not require him to use the legislature to impose these tariffs. He's used national security rules to do it. So he may try to continue with this same plan. Despite that, I don't think the trade war is going to have much of an effect on the midterm elections, because I think most Americans aren't going to notice it until they go into Walmart and they find out the prices have gone up, or they get a notice at work that they're being laid off. And that's when they're going to start to vote, and that could be more likely the 2020 election.
Gotcha.
Yeah, my theory is that the midterm election is going to, as you said, make the Democrats take over Congress and make the Mueller investigation more interesting. I think there's a real likelihood that there'll be more evidences released and disclosed after the midterm election, and Democrats probably will indeed initiate the impeachment process, and that will put further pressure on Donald Trump to think of ways to distract attention, to think of ways to sort of muster American support in dealing with a foreign force, and that is China. China's always been, unfortunately, a sort of a bogeyman in U.S. elections, and in this case, it's very likely that he is going to further use that issue to further, stir up nationalism, I think, in the United States.
So a lot of people have been talking about this really isn't just about trade. This is also about technology dominance. Sort of curious in terms of why can't there be multiple leaders on the global stage in terms of tech dominance? Why can't we share this pie? And in terms of technology transfers, this white paper has stated that this is voluntary technology transfers in terms of foreign companies wanting to come to do business here in China, because no one is forcing a company to do business here, right? If you want to come over, then you're voluntarily transferring the technology. So what's your take on that, Professor Gillis? Let's start with you.
Well, there were arguments that China was stealing technology, and I think there perhaps was a time that happened. I heard that has largely quit after Barack Obama and Xi Jinping agreed that it would not happen again.
Lots of progress on the IPR front.
And I think most businesses here say that intellectual property rights can actually be protected in China. That's not an issue, a major issue. The problem has been put forth that in many situations joint ventures are required. And if you want to make a joint venture to make automobiles in China, somebody's got to bring the technology to do it. And usually that's the U.S. company.
The acquisitions related to this in the Section 301 report, in my opinion, are very old. The examples they cited are very, very old, and and in some cases at least 10 years old. And the second thing I want to mention is that I think right now the Trump administration is keen on sort of trumping up these acquisitions. And there's a report from Axios today saying that they're going to intensify the acquisitions of theft of intellectual properties, stuff like that. I mean, these things are, first of all, they're kind of old, and second, I think, in terms of intelligence probing, I mean, both sides are doing this, and it was reported in the Access report that Donald Trump basically is saying, just go ahead and do this. So I think there's an element of trumping up these things for propaganda purposes. So I think, I'm very pessimistic that, if they're doing things like that, there's no reason to negotiate anymore.
Well, there's always not enough time to talk about China's U.S. Trade relations. We've got about, 30 seconds left on the program, so we're going to have to leave the discussion there. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, and Professor Paul Gillis from the Peking University Guanghua School of Management. Many thanks for your time, and I'm sure we have a lot more to discuss in the days ahead. This is Dialogue. I'm Michael Wong. We'll see you again at the same time tomorrow.